Here we are, close to the wrap-up of Season 3 of the Death Dhamma podcast. What a good time to take stock of what our wise teachers have shared with us around their own experiences of clinging and aversion. Hi, it's Margaret Maloney, and welcome to Season 3 of the Death Dhamma podcast. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so appreciative that you are part of my community. And yet, I seek not to be attached to the idea of the podcast or even to the idea of our community. And that's our topic this season: attachment, clinging, and aversion. What happens when we really want something? What happens when we really don't want something? And what does it do to our suffering and dissatisfaction? Let's dive in and find out a little bit more with today's episode. We've had the opportunity to speak to quite a few different wise teachers about clinging and aversion. And each has brought their own unique perspective to the discussion, sharing ideas of attachment to people, or running away from difficult situations, or having a certain sense of self, or even what is the basis for attachment, whether or not it's just part of who we are as a human. And at this point, it's safe to say that we can gather some common themes, some pieces of, you might call it, universal or collective wisdom to help us navigate the concept of clinging and aversion, and the fact that, yes, this is what we face, and it's going to be okay. We started the season with a good reminder from Dr. Seth Zuiho Segal that we are not emotionless robots who function as remote islands. Of course we have attachments to one another. Here is a clip from that discussion.
So in talking about attachment, the first thought I have is that that's a very complicated subject. Everyone seems to think that Buddhism says don't get attached, that non-attachment is the thing that we ought to manifest in some kind of way or realize. Mm-hmm. And I have a lot of problems with that idea, just simply said, because there are different kinds of attachments and different things we can become attached to. So we can become attached to people, mm-hmm. like when we fall in love, or we can become attached to objects, like if you think about a young child and its teddy bear.
Sure.
Or we can become attached to opinions about various things, or yes. Various kinds of practices. This is the way it's always been done, and this is the way it ought to be done. Mm-hmm. And we can become attached to different images of ourselves too, who we think we are, or who we think we ought to be. So some of us take our profession as our identity. You know, I'm a scholar, or I'm an athlete, and that becomes who you are in some kind of important way. If you look at the ancient Buddhist texts, okay, for example, there's a advanced set of teachings called the Abhidharma, and they talk about attachments. They talk about 4 kinds of attachments. They talk about attachment to sensual pleasure. Mm-hmm. They talk about attachment to ideas or views, mm-hmm. Attachments to certain kind of rites and rituals, and then lastly, attachments to a certain view of oneself. Those are the ones that they warn against specifically. They don't say, though, in those books, don't get attached to people, okay?
Seth makes the valid point that we need people in our lives in order to progress on the path.
I just want to say that I have a vision of what it means to flourish as a human being. Okay. And that means flourishing in a number of different domains. And the main domains are in the field of relationships, mm-hmm. field of accomplishments, and the field of aesthetics. And I think that the relationships are probably the most important part for most people, that the things that give us a sense that we're really flourishing are the quality of the relationships that we're embedded within. Our relationships with our parents and our spouses, our children, our friends. Mm-hmm. Those are what give our life the most meaning and the most sense of fulfillment. Okay. And if we're giving those up, we're giving up a major area where we might actually create well-being for ourselves. And I'll also say that it's within that field of relationships where it's the most crucial place to practice mindfulness and equanimity and compassion and loving kindness, all the virtues that we're trying to develop along the Buddhist path. We can do it better in a field of relationships than we can do anywhere else. So this idea that comes down from us from the monastic form of Buddhism, that we ought to give up relationships and just, meditate on our navels and stuff. That I don't think that really brings us where we want to go. I think it's really in this world of relationship that we really learn how to improve our well-being.
And yet, from Venerable D, we learned that sometimes the people we form attachments to mistreat us. And from that abuse, we develop ideas about our worth, or perhaps that we lack worth. And as we move on in life to live a healthy life, to become free from that suffering, it's necessary to let go of the wrong self-views and the hard feelings that we may have developed from our abusers.
It's not you. If people reject you, it's not you, it's them. Yeah.
Their choice, their journey, they have their own soundtrack playing in their heads.
Yeah. It's important to recognize that.
For us to offer them loving kindness.
Yes. Oh, definitely. I practice loving kindness on a daily basis. I hope this help people out there, no matter what you're going through, just remember you're not alone and practice loving kindness and compassion for yourself.
These thoughts that we have about ourselves, whether they come from abuse or not, they become our guidelines, or as Mary Stancavage said, our operating system. We form this idea of who we are, and we use that to make decisions, and eventually hanging on to these notions may no longer serve us. Mary, the archaeologist, we let go of, kind of, but a piece of her has always lived on, and she has come back. The rebirth, I'll call it a rebirth. She has been reborn. That might be a silly way to say it. She's come back in a way that you can participate without maybe attaching to what you felt when you were, first an archaeologist. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly. I started it originally because I really enjoy it. I find it fascinating and interesting, and that's why I'm still doing it. And it's no longer attached to my persona. I don't have this view of I need to have this in my life in order for people to like me. For me, I've learned when I'm really uncomfortable, that's when I have to drop below the story, like dropping below the idea of cool, and say, what is fueling that? What's just really dive down, keep asking, what's this? What's this? What's this? That inquiry that takes you down and, gets below the surface. That's what I find most helpful, because a lot of times it has nothing to do with the story. It's underneath.
But is attachment bad? Just like Seth, Dave Smith warns us to be careful about saying bad attachment, or thinking it's bad.
I think that it's easy to, attachment gets a bit of a bad reputation, and we can suffer a lot around things. We're attached to things, and we lose the things we're attached to, and I think it's part of the deal, right? So I think one of the first things that I would say is to be careful that we don't think that we want to be non-attached.
And Dave introduces us to the concept of lobha, or greed. It is greed that can make attachment problematic, greed that causes us to cling and suffer.
That's right. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at the history, where the Buddha, the term that he uses for this is upadana, which means to cling. Clinging and grasping comes from this Pali word upadana, which means more than just that. And so in the Vedic tradition, in the Upanishads, they had these sacrificial fires, which were called upadanas.
Okay.
And so what the Buddha says is that you want these fires to go out, the fires of greed, hatred, and confusion to go out. But upadana has a double meaning. It means to cling and to grasp, but it also means to fuel. So in what ways are we clinging and grasping and being greedy? But in what ways are we throwing gasoline, or are we stoking our own fires of greed, hatred, or confusion, or greed in this sense, right? So how do we, so we can be clear about like what are things, maybe like doom scrolling on the internet is stoking fires, or looking at shit to buy on Amazon is still, So there's a lot of things that we do that fuel it. And so if you want to be happy and you want to be content and you want to be liberated in this world, you want your fires to go out. So So you need to stop putting gas and logs on the fires,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really easy concept. Like no one's going to have my 10-year-old kid could understand this. This is not this whole idea of having a fire and putting the fire out, which is why I think the Buddha uses these metaphors, is they're very basic.
Yes.
They're not esoteric, they're not mystical, they're very practical that way.
And at this point, perhaps it is no surprise that Dave introduces us or reminds us of kindness and patience towards ourselves and others. We need a metta practice. That inner voice.
Yeah, not good enough. Right. Not trying hard enough. So I think if you can address those are two big ones, and also too, it's like metta everywhere. It has been for a long time. But my experience was when people come into my program or I meet people and I ask them about their metta practice, most people say they don't have one.
Okay.
I very, very, very rarely do I encounter a practitioner who has a robust, regular practice of kindness for themselves. Okay. And so if you do those two things right out of the gate, I think in little as 90 or 100 days, you can really turn the table on that whole thing. So if there's a sense of kindness, a sense of ease, kindness towards myself, then the whole doing it right or doing it wrong thing, that just kind of starts to fall away. And if we change the paradigm there, then you can go, if you can get over those two hurdles, you can really do all kinds of amazing things.
Now, I'm sure you're recognizing a trend here, and that is that a big part of our discussions on attachment this season really come down to some key concepts. Number one, we will have attachment. Number two, we are not bad human beings or bad Buddhists because of this, although it is the root of our suffering, but it's what we're working on. Three, we can think of it as evolutionary. So I want you to consider what Bill Belanger says. Why is this still happening to us?
It's interesting. I think that's a deep question. I think it's on an individual level and like a social, cultural level. Mm-hmm. But to me, I think it's just the nature of what it is to be a human. It just seems so hardwired into our physiology. So one of the things that has been interesting for me, I mentioned before we started recording that I have a newborn. Mm-hmm. So being with him, it's been this interesting teaching on this reactivity and the suffering. And I'm already kind of thinking about it a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. But again, this idea that we're reactive to the events that happen in our lives and we try to move towards what we like and move away from what we don't like. For my newborn infant, that's a perfectly appropriate response. That's exactly what he should be doing, right? So that this fussiness of his diaper is wet or he's hungry or he's too cold or he's too warm, that's letting us know that he needs attention and is basically helping him to live. If he didn't have that deep level of reactivity, he'd be in big trouble pretty quickly. So I think the way that I'm looking at it now is that this is just part of being a human. It's probably just part of being a mammal in general, just any animal, that it's really it's a survival level instinct first. Okay. And we're not really hardwired to just be content and happy all the time, because that's not going to encourage us to go, take care of our needs or mate or get food. It's more of this dissatisfaction kind of drives our behavior rather. So I think it's just a deeply hardwired thing. And mm-hmm. I think it is a privilege and a luxury when you can live in a time and a place where you have the ability to look at your mind and work with your mind and be curious about it. Because I think for most people, they never get to that. It's so much on the survival level living, mm-hmm. and even in the West too, just of being stressed out and burned out and focus on the next thing.
What some teachers have reminded me of is that it comes back to being skillful. It's not that you're never going to want breakfast. It's being skillful about that. It's not that you're never going to want to be comfortable when it's hot or stay away from flooding and storms. It's how we do it and what we do to be comfortable. Also, it's okay to be uncomfortable. Our growth on the path comes from being uncomfortable. But yes, from an evolutionary perspective, of course, we pay attention to hunger and dangers to our survival. And for the other challenges, look at your intention. Do that deep inquiry that Mary Stankiewicz told us about. Ask yourself, am I being skillful? And of course, am I remembering my metta practice? Am I showing loving kindness to myself and others? No matter what, we will face attachments of different kinds and aversions to different things. It's what we work on as human beings to obtain release from suffering. I would love to hear from you, your thoughts, your suggestions, your own stories about attachment. So follow this link, I'm going to read it to you in a minute here, to leave me a 90-second message with your ideas and suggestions. You can go to https://www.speakpipe.com/death_Dhamma_podcast. I suppose you could also just use your favorite search engine to say SpeakPipe Death Dhamma Podcast. And there you can record an audio message for me. And be sure to come over to margaretmaloney.com. That's MargaretMeloni.com and join the community. You've been listening to the Death Dhamma Podcast with your host, Margaret Maloney. Thank you so much for being here. Come find me on margaretmaloney.com, MargaretMeloni.com. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be at ease, and may you be free from suffering. Bye for now.